What if everything you worked for vanished in a single day? Welcome to a story of hope, risk, and survival. A tale of dreams built high and shattered overnight. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a journey into one of the most dramatic and emotional moments the world has ever seen. The stock market crash of 1929, also known as Black Tuesday. But this isn't just about numbers or graphs. This is the story of real people. Workers, farmers, business owners, and families who were caught in the storm. They trusted the system. They believed in success. And then, in a wave of panic, their savings disappeared. Their homes were taken. Their dreams crumbled. But even as they lost everything, many didn't give up. Grab your headphones, settle in, and prepare to step back into a world where fortunes were made and lost in the blink of an eye. This is the story of Black Tuesday and the people who fought to rise again. Chapter 1. The Roaring Twenties, a Decade of Dreams. It was a time when people believed the good times would never end. The 1920s began with hope and excitement. World War I had ended, and people were ready for something new. Life felt lighter. Streets filled with the sounds of cars and laughter. Women wore shorter dresses, danced the Charleston, and dreamed of independence. Men bought new suits and planned bright futures. Everything is possible, they thought. New inventions made life easier. In kitchens, refrigerators hummed quietly. Washing machines did the hard work, so people had more free time. The radio was a game changer. It connected people across cities and farms. Families gathered in the living room to listen to jazz, sports games, and breaking news. It was magic. Voices and music traveling through the air. Factories couldn't produce goods fast enough. Cars, radios, and appliances rolled off assembly lines every day. People wanted them all. Credit made it possible. Buy now, pay later, advertisements promised. And many did. They borrowed money to buy cars and clothes, to build homes, and to enjoy life. Then came the stock market, a place of dreams. Wall Street was the heart of it all, located in New York City. Stocks were like tickets to wealth. If you invested $100 today, you could make $1,000 tomorrow. Or so people believed. The market kept rising. Why work hard when you can let your money work for you? Whispered brokers. It wasn't just the rich who invested. Office workers, teachers, and even farmers used their savings to buy shares. Some borrowed money from banks to invest even more. It was easy, too easy. Look at my neighbor, a man might say. He just bought a new car with his stock earnings. I should do the same. Everywhere, people celebrated. They filled dance halls, drank cocktails, and laughed at worries. Jazz bands played late into the night. Cities sparkled with electric lights, and the sound of typewriters clacked in office buildings. Hope filled the air like perfume. But while the cities danced, some struggled quietly. Farmers faced tough times. Crop prices fell, and they earned less money. In small towns, businesses saw fewer customers. Factories produced more goods than people could afford to buy. Piles of unsold cars, radios, and clothes sat in warehouses. No one wanted to talk about these problems. The market will fix itself, experts said. Then there was the issue of loans. People borrowed too much money, not just for cars and homes, but for stocks. They didn't think about what might happen if prices fell. They won't fall, most people insisted. Optimism was blinding. No one wanted to believe that the good times could end. Banks, too, were confident. They loaned money freely. They believed in the market's power. If customers couldn't repay their loans, banks expected to sell the stocks and recover their losses. It was a cycle built on trust and a bit of denial. By 1929, the stock market had reached dizzying heights. Newspapers reported success stories every day. A young man invests a few dollars and buys a new house. A retired teacher turns her savings into a fortune. Stories like these made people feel unstoppable. No one wanted to miss out. But cracks in the foundation had already appeared. Many companies weren't as profitable as their stock prices suggested. Investors didn't care. They kept buying. The excitement of the market made people blind to reality. "It's too big to fail," they said. But deep down, some were starting to feel nervous. Quiet whispers of doubt spread through offices and trading floors. Yet, for most, hope drowned out fear. The parties continued. The jazz played on. People toasted to their bright futures, unaware that a storm was brewing just beyond the horizon. What happens when the music stops, when dreams built on shaky ground begin to crumble? That moment would arrive soon, sooner than anyone imagined. Chapter 2. The Stock Market. The Money Machine. You buy a little today, and tomorrow you're rich. In the 1920s, the stock market was like a magic trick. People believed it could turn a few dollars into a fortune. Wall Street, located in New York City, was the stage where this magic happened. The stock exchange buzzed with life. Men in suits shouted orders. Telephones rang. Papers flew through the air. It was fast, loud, and exciting. People lined up to buy stocks. Rich businessmen, teachers, small shop owners, even milkmen wanted a piece of the action. The idea was simple. Buy a stock today and sell it later for a higher price. Easy money, they called it. Why work long hours when you could make a profit by just investing? But what exactly was a stock? A stock is like owning a small piece of a company. If the company does well, the value of the stock goes up. You can sell it for more than you paid and keep the profit. This system wasn't new, but in the 1920s it became a frenzy. Banks played a big role. They lent money to anyone who wanted to invest. It didn't matter if you didn't have enough savings. All you had to do was borrow. "We trust you," banks said. With borrowed money, people bought more stocks than they could afford. This method was called buying on margin. It worked like this. You paid a small part of the stock's price up front, and the bank covered the rest. At first, this strategy seemed to work perfectly. Stocks kept rising. everyone was making money, or so it seemed. "Look at me," a young man might brag to his friends. "I bought stocks last month, and now I can afford a car." His friends would rush to buy stocks too, hoping for the same result. But not all stocks were tied to real success. Some companies weren't making as much money as people thought. Their stocks were overpriced, but no one cared. As long as prices went up, the truth didn't seem to matter. People trusted the system blindly. Newspapers added to the excitement. Headlines shouted stories of overnight success. A teacher turns $1,000 into $10,000, or ordinary man becomes millionaire in 1 year. These stories inspired others. They believed they could do it too. Yet, the system had risks. What would happen if stock prices stopped going up? What if they fell instead? Many investors didn't think about that. They assumed the market would keep rising forever. "Why worry?" they said. "This is America. We always win." Stockbrokers encouraged this belief. Their job was to help people buy and sell stocks, and they earned a commission on every deal. The more people invested, the more money brokers made. So they said whatever investors wanted to hear. "Buy now," they whispered. "The market is strong." Behind the scenes, cracks were beginning to show. Some investors, the ones who paid close attention, noticed that certain companies were struggling. Their profits weren't growing as fast as expected. These investors started selling their stocks. Quietly, at first. But once a few sold, others followed. Meanwhile, ordinary people were still rushing to invest. They trusted the newspapers. They trusted their neighbors. They trusted the brokers and the banks. If everyone else is doing it, they thought, I should too. The excitement wasn't just in New York. Across the country, people invested. Small towns and big cities alike were connected by the dream of getting rich. Farmers who worked the land during the day bought stocks in the evening. Factory workers used their wages to join the stock market frenzy. Even housewives put aside savings to invest. This was the magic of the stock market, or so they thought. But magic tricks have secrets, and they don't last forever. By 1929, the stock market was a tower built on borrowed money. If stocks continued to rise, the tower would stand tall. But if they fell, even a little, the tower could collapse. No one wanted to imagine that. It's too big to fail, they said. The market will always recover. But deep down, some investors felt uneasy. They watched the prices climb higher and higher. They asked themselves, is this too good to be true? For now, though, the music played on. Investors danced with their profits. The brokers smiled. The banks kept lending. Nobody knew it yet. But the show was about to end. And when it did, it would be a disaster. Chapter 3. The warning signs, but no one listened. Why worry? Stocks always go up. In 1929, the streets of New York were as busy as ever. Wall Street pulsed with energy. Stock prices flashed on electric boards. Brokers dashed from one phone to another, yelling into receivers. The market looked unstoppable. But behind the noise, a few voices of caution whispered. Not everyone believed in the dream. Some experts, economists, and bankers saw the truth. They watched prices rise higher than logic could explain. "This can't last," one expert muttered, shaking his head as he looked over a company's financial report. The company wasn't making any real profits, but its stock price kept climbing. Something's wrong, he thought. These experts tried to warn people. In meetings, they spoke cautiously, offering advice. They said, "Prices are too high. Too much money is borrowed. People can't keep buying like this forever." But their words were drowned by the noise of celebration. Why would anyone listen to bad news during a party? The newspapers printed glowing headlines. "Stocks reach new heights," shouted one front page. "The market keeps winning," declared another. Radio broadcasts added fuel to the excitement. People trusted what they read and heard. They wanted good news, and they got plenty of it. Even when a few newspapers ran warnings, readers turned the page. It was easier to believe in success. After all, wasn't everyone getting rich? Why worry about tomorrow when today was so bright? Business owners ignored the warnings too. Many expanded their factories or opened new stores. They borrowed more money, expecting to pay it back once they sold more products. Bankers encouraged them. "Don't be afraid," they said. "The market is strong." But cracks were forming. Some investors, the cautious ones, noticed them. They sold their stocks quietly. They didn't want to cause panic, but they also didn't want to be left holding worthless shares. Others, like small-time investors, had no idea what was happening. They kept buying stocks, hoping for bigger returns. On Wall Street, a few seasoned traders felt uneasy. They watched the prices rise each day, knowing that something wasn't right. "This is a bubble," one whispered to a colleague. "When it bursts, we're in trouble." His colleague nodded, but neither of them sold their shares yet. Fear of missing out kept them in the game. The trouble was that no one could predict exactly when the bubble would burst. It might last another year, or it might pop tomorrow. The uncertainty made it easy for most people to ignore the warnings. It was human nature. Why think about danger when everything seems perfect? Bankers had their own reasons for staying silent. They had given out too many loans. If they admitted the market was in trouble, borrowers might panic. Panicked borrowers wouldn't be able to repay their loans. And if the banks failed, the entire system could collapse. Meanwhile, factory owners noticed something strange. Warehouses were filling up with unsold goods. People had bought plenty of cars, radios, and appliances in the early 1920s, but now many couldn't afford new ones. Salaries weren't rising as fast as prices, and debt was piling up. Farmers also struggled. Crop prices had dropped, and they couldn't sell enough to make a profit. Many had borrowed money to buy new equipment, expecting to pay it back easily. But with low crop prices, they were sinking deeper into debt. Some farmers lost their land. They had gambled on good times, and the gamble had failed. But even this wasn't enough to stop the market frenzy. The belief in endless success was too powerful. "Stocks are like gold," said one optimistic investor. "They never lose value." The brokers agreed. Why wouldn't they? Their income depended on people buying stocks. A few companies began closing their doors, but the news barely made a ripple. Bigger companies were still booming, at least on paper. People clung to hope. No one wanted to admit that the party might be ending. But deep in their hearts, some felt the tension. There was a strange quiet beneath the surface, like the stillness before a storm. Small signals appeared. Nothing big, just tiny cracks in the foundation. A bank here, a business there, struggling to stay afloat. By the summer of 1929, those cracks had widened. But instead of slowing down, investors kept pushing the market higher. "Let's ride this wave," they said. Just a little longer. No one wanted to miss out on the final profits. Then, in September, the market showed its first real sign of weakness. Prices wobbled. A few stocks dipped. Some investors hesitated, unsure if this was just a small bump or something bigger. The warnings became louder. "Sell now." One cautious trader advised his client. "Don't wait." But most people still didn't listen. Why should they? The market always bounced back, didn't it? For years, that belief had been true. Why would this time be different? As October approached, tensions grew. Behind the excitement, behind the headlines, fear was creeping in. The cracks in the foundation were now impossible to ignore. The market was on edge, balancing between success and disaster. No one knew it yet, but the fall had already begun. Chapter 4. Black Thursday. The first shock. The phones rang non-stop. Investors yelled, panicked, and begged for help. The morning of October 24th, 1929 started quietly. The sun rose over New York City, and the streets hummed with their usual rhythm. Office workers hurried to their desks. Shopkeepers opened their stores. Wall Street, as always, prepared for another busy trading day. No one knew that history was about to be made. At 9:30 a.m., the New York Stock Exchange opened. Traders expected a normal day, maybe a few ups and downs, but nothing unusual. For the first few minutes, everything seemed fine. But then, the first sell orders hit the market. A few stocks dipped, but that wasn't unusual. Prices often moved up and down. But within minutes, the sell orders kept coming. More and more investors wanted to sell their shares. Prices fell, slowly at first, then faster. Panic spread through the trading floor. Phone operators couldn't keep up. The lines were jammed. Telephones rang non-stop, and brokers shouted into their receivers. "Sell it now!" one yelled. "At any price!" Investors, from large companies to ordinary people, rushed to get rid of their stocks, but no one was buying. By mid-morning, the market was in chaos. Stock prices collapsed. General Electric, a symbol of American success, dropped like a stone. Shares of steel companies, automobile makers, and banks were dumped in waves. The air was electric with fear. Traders darted between booths, sweat dripping down their faces. Some waved papers in the air, desperate for a buyer, any buyer. But the buyers were gone. The selling continued. In homes and offices across the country, radios broadcast the news. For those listening, it didn't feel real. Some thought it was just a temporary dip. The market always bounces back, they reassured themselves. This will pass. But others, those who had borrowed heavily to buy stocks, felt the first sting of fear. What if this time was different? Inside the stock exchange, the tension was unbearable. A trader leaned against the wall, clutching his chest. "We're finished," he whispered to a colleague. Another man, pale and shaking, grabbed a telephone and dialed his bank. "I need more funds," he begged, but the bank couldn't help. There were too many like him, too many desperate voices calling for help. On the trading floor, a young assistant stood frozen, watching the chaos unfold. He had dreamed of becoming a successful broker, of making a name for himself on Wall Street. But today, he saw something he would never forget. Men who, just yesterday, had been confident and powerful, now looked lost. One broker dropped to his knees and buried his face in his hands. "It's over," he whispered. By noon, the wave of panic had spread beyond Wall Street. Across the country, people rushed to check their investments. Small investors, who had saved for years to buy stocks, began to realize they had lost everything. John, a schoolteacher in Ohio, listened to the radio with wide eyes. "What does this mean?" his wife asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. He didn't know. At the stock exchange, rumors spread. "The market will close early," one man said. "The banks are stepping in," said another. But no one knew for sure. It felt like the ground beneath them had disappeared. Then, around noon, a glimmer of hope appeared. A group of powerful bankers, led by Richard Whitney, vice president of the exchange, stepped onto the trading floor. They had formed a plan. With millions of dollars pooled together, they would buy key stocks and stop the free fall. Whitney approached the trading booth for U.S. Steel, one of the biggest companies in the country. In a loud, clear voice, he placed a massive order to buy shares at a high price. For a moment, the room went silent. People held their breath. If Whitney could restore confidence, maybe the market would recover. Other bankers followed his lead, placing similar orders. The market slowed its descent. Stocks stabilized, at least for a little while. Relief washed over the room. But outside the exchange, the damage had already been done. Thousands of investors had sold their shares at huge losses. Many of them had borrowed money to buy stocks and now owed more than they could repay. Across the country, people listened anxiously to the radio, waiting for updates. Some cried. Others stared at their savings statements in disbelief. Their dreams of wealth had vanished in a single morning. By the end of the day, the market had partially recovered, But the cracks in the foundation were clear. Bankers tried to reassure the public. The worst is over, they claimed. But in their hearts, they weren't so sure. That night, the streets of New York were quieter than usual. The usual buzz of optimism was gone. In small apartments, luxurious homes, and tiny farmhouses, people sat in silence, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Was today just a bad day? Or the start of something much worse? In the coming days, they would find out. Black Thursday was only the beginning. Chapter 5. Black Monday. The market in free fall. The numbers on the board kept dropping and dropping. The weekend brought a strange mix of hope and fear. Some investors believed that the worst was behind them. Black Thursday had been bad, yes, but hadn't the market recovered slightly by the end of the day? The banks had stepped in. Surely, that meant things would improve on Monday. Right? But not everyone felt optimistic. Many couldn't sleep. They lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining what they might lose. Some prayed. Others paced their living rooms, smoking cigarette after cigarette, waiting for dawn to break. When Monday, October 28th, 1929, finally arrived, Wall Street was ready, but not in the way people had hoped. The trading floor was crowded before the bell even rang. A thick tension filled the air. Brokers shuffled their feet, glancing nervously at the clock. Phones buzzed and rang. The opening bell sounded, and the chaos began. Within minutes, it was clear. Things were getting worse. Stocks plummeted, faster and harder than on Thursday. People tried to sell whatever they could, but there were no buyers. The numbers on the board weren't just falling, they were crashing. Shares of major companies, once worth thousands of dollars, were suddenly worthless. "Sell! Sell now!" shouted a trader, his voice cracking with panic. He waved a stack of papers in the air, but no one was interested. Around him, others screamed into phones, their faces pale. It was like a sinking ship, and everyone was scrambling for lifeboats. But there weren't enough. In the streets outside the stock exchange, crowds gathered. Men and women huddled around radios, listening to live updates. Some stared at the building as if it might hold the answer to their prayers. But there were no answers, just bad news. Every few minutes, someone would push through the crowd, crying or swearing. The losses were massive, and the day had only just begun. Inside, the phones never stopped ringing. Bankers called to check their clients' accounts. Investors begged for help. "What do I do?" one man sobbed over the phone to his broker. "You told me this was safe. I trusted you." But the broker had no advice to give. He had lost his own savings, too. By mid-morning, rumors of banks closing began to spread. People panicked. If the banks ran out of money, they wouldn't be able to pay their customers. Those who had savings rushed to withdraw their cash. Long lines formed outside banks, stretching down the streets. Some customers were turned away. The banks didn't have enough cash on hand. Back on Wall Street, things were spiraling out of control. One investor, a middle-aged man in a worn suit, stood frozen in place, staring at the numbers on the board. His hands trembled as he whispered to himself, "It can't be real. It can't be happening." Tears streamed down his face. He had lost everything, his savings, his house, and his future. Nearby, a young woman sat on the floor, her back against the wall. She clutched a crumpled piece of paper and rocked back and forth. "I've lost everything," she murmured over and over. A stranger tried to comfort her, but she didn't respond. By early afternoon, the market had fallen further than anyone expected. Stocks that had been considered untouchable, pillars of American success, were now worth almost nothing. Major companies, banks, and factories were losing millions by the minute. The noise on the trading floor was deafening. Papers littered the floor like fallen leaves. Some traders had given up trying to sell. They sat at their desks, heads in their hands, waiting for the bell to signal the end of the day. Outside, the crowd grew restless. Reporters shouted questions at anyone leaving the building. "How bad is it?" one asked a broker as he exited. The man didn't answer. He kept walking, his head down, his briefcase swinging limply at his side. For small investors, the situation was devastating. Many had put their life savings into the stock market, hoping for a better future. Now, that future had disappeared in a matter of hours. In a small apartment in Chicago, an elderly couple sat in silence at their kitchen table. The radio played softly in the background. The man stared at the floor, unable to look at his wife. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I thought we'd be okay." On farms, in cities, and in towns across America, millions of people felt the same wave of despair. They had trusted the system. They had believed the promises of endless prosperity. And now, it was gone. As the final bell rang to close the market, a strange hush fell over Wall Street. The numbers stopped flashing. The phones went silent. But the damage had already been done. The market had lost billions in a single day, more than anyone had thought possible. For those who had lost everything, Black Monday was more than just a date on the calendar. It was the day their dreams collapsed. But the worst part? The next day would be even darker. Tuesday was waiting, and it would leave an even deeper scar. Before we begin Chapter 6, a quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on WooEnglish. Remember, this content is specially made for WooEnglish listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of WooEnglish's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now, let's continue the story. Chapter 6, Black Tuesday, a day the world would never forget. A tidal wave of terror swept through Wall Street. October 29th, 1929, dawned cold and gray. The wind blew down the streets of New York City, but the chill outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing on Wall Street. By the time the stock market opened that morning, the air was thick with fear. People had been dreading this day ever since Black Monday. Their worst nightmare was about to come true. Brokers and traders crowded the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. Phones rang constantly. The first trades of the day showed what everyone feared most. Prices were already falling. Stocks that had been valuable yesterday were suddenly worth almost nothing. The board lit up with red numbers, signaling massive losses. Panic spread like wildfire. Investors scrambled to sell their stocks. Desperation filled the room. "Sell it," a man shouted, waving a piece of paper over his head. "I don't care how much I lose." But there were no buyers. Prices dropped lower and lower. The more people sold, the faster they fell. It was like a free fall, and no one could stop it. On the trading floor, brokers ran from booth to booth, shouting orders. Their voices cracked under the pressure. Some ripped off their ties and threw them to the floor. Others collapsed into chairs, staring blankly at the chaos around them. "We're finished," one man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's over." Outside the stock exchange, crowds gathered, hoping for news. Many had come to see for themselves if the rumors were true. Was the market really crashing? Was their money gone? They stood in clusters, their eyes fixed on the building. Policemen tried to keep order, but the crowd kept growing. Among them was a middle-aged man named Samuel, who had invested his life savings in the market. His hands trembled as he held a copy of the morning paper. The headlines screamed, "Stocks plunge again." He wiped his forehead, his mind racing. How would he tell his family? What would happen to their home? Next to him, a young woman named Clara clutched her purse. Her fiancé had bought stocks with a loan, hoping to pay for their wedding and buy a small house. But now, everything was slipping away. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "What will we do now?" Inside the exchange, the chaos continued. A man stood on a desk and waved his arms, trying to get attention. "We need buyers," he cried, but no one listened. Another broker leaned against the wall, his head in his hands. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. By noon, the market had lost billions of dollars. Entire fortunes had vanished in hours. Banks that had invested in the stock market were now at risk of collapse. Companies that had once been symbols of success faced ruin. Workers across the country, unaware of what was happening, were about to lose their jobs. The mood on Wall Street turned darker. A man in a neatly pressed suit staggered out of the building, his face pale. He sank to the sidewalk, unable to speak. A reporter approached him, but he shook his head and waved the man away. He had nothing to say. His dreams were gone. Rumors of suicide began to spread. Some claimed that desperate investors had jumped from buildings. While these stories were exaggerated, the emotional toll was real. For many, Black Tuesday felt like the end of the world. Everything they had worked for was gone, and there was no way to get it back. Banks sent their representatives to try to calm things down, but it was too late. Even the wealthiest investors couldn't stop the collapse. The foundation of the market had cracked, and now the entire structure was falling apart. It was a tidal wave, unstoppable and merciless. As the day dragged on, the crowds outside grew quiet. There were no more shouts or cries, just the sound of footsteps and the hum of passing cars. People left the scene in silence, their heads down, thinking about what they had lost. By the time the market closed that evening, the damage was done. More than $14 billion had been lost in a single day. The newspapers would call it the greatest financial disaster in history. For those who had invested everything, it was more than just numbers. It was their homes, their futures, their dreams. That night, Samuel sat at his kitchen table, a blank piece of paper in front of him. He needed to write a letter to his wife explaining what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. How do you tell someone that everything is gone? Clara sat on her bed, her engagement ring in her hand. She stared at it, tears falling down her cheeks. "I thought this would be our new beginning," she whispered. "Now, we don't even have a future." In the days that followed, the news spread across the country. People lined up outside banks, hoping to withdraw their money before the banks failed. Factories began laying off workers. Farmers, already struggling with low crop prices, sank deeper into debt. The Great Depression had begun. But that evening, as the lights of New York flickered in the distance, no one could fully understand what had just happened. They only knew that something had changed forever. Black Tuesday would be remembered not just as a day of financial ruin, but as a moment that shook the world to its core. For now, the city slept, but in the coming days, the full weight of the disaster would be felt by millions. Chapter 7. Broken Dreams, Personal Stories of Loss. I trusted the market, and now my family has nothing. The stock market crash wasn't just a financial disaster. It was a human tragedy. Behind the numbers were real people, men and women who had dreams, families, and plans for the future. They had trusted the system, believed in success, and imagined better lives for themselves. But in an instant, it all vanished. John's story, a small business owner. John had worked hard all his life. He wasn't a rich man, but he was proud of what he had built. He owned a small hardware store in a quiet neighborhood. For years, customers came to him when they needed tools, nails, or paint. He knew them by name, and they knew him as an honest, hard-working man. When the stock market was booming, John felt pressure to invest. His friends told him it was easy money. "Why leave your savings sitting in the bank?" one friend asked. "The market is the future. Put your money to work." At first, John was unsure. He didn't know much about stocks, but everyone around him seemed so confident. So, John took a chance. He withdrew his life savings, money he had worked for over 2 decades, and bought shares in a manufacturing company. The stock price rose quickly. At first, he felt like a genius. "I should have done this years ago," he thought. He reinvested the profits, buying more shares. Then Black Tuesday came. In one day, everything changed. The stock price plummeted. He called his broker, but it was too late. "I'm sorry, John," the broker said. "There's nothing I can do." John was devastated. His savings were gone. He couldn't pay the rent for his store. Within weeks, he was forced to close it. His customers stopped coming, and the shelves that were once full of supplies sat empty. John stared at the keys to his shop one last time before locking the door for good. At home, he struggled to tell his family. His wife cried when she heard the news. His children didn't understand why their father, who had always provided for them, now looked defeated. One night, his youngest son asked, "Dad, why are we eating bread and soup every day?" John didn't answer. He couldn't. In the weeks that followed, John searched for work. But so did thousands of others. There were no jobs. The streets were full of men in worn-out coats, standing in lines that stretched around city blocks. Bread lines, they were called. John stood there too, holding an empty sack, waiting for a small piece of bread to bring home. How did this happen? He wondered, over and over. But there was no answer. Clara's story. A factory worker. Clara woke up early every day, long before the sun rose. She worked in a textile factory, sewing clothes and curtains. The factory was noisy, hot, and crowded. The machines clanged and roared, and the smell of oil hung in the air. But Clara didn't mind. The job paid well enough, and she was saving to buy a house one day. She dreamed of a small home with a garden. Just a few more years, she told herself, and it'll be mine. She kept a picture of a house in her pocket and looked at it during breaks. It gave her hope. But after the stock market crash, everything changed. The factory owner had invested heavily in the market and lost most of his money. Orders for clothes slowed down. "People aren't buying new clothes anymore," her boss explained. "We're cutting costs. I'm sorry, Clara. We have to let you go." She packed her things and walked home, clutching her final paycheck. The streets were quiet, except for the sound of distant traffic. She passed by a group of men talking in low voices. Their faces were grim. One of them turned to Clara and asked, "Did you lose your job too?" She nodded, unable to speak. When she got home, she sat at the kitchen table and stared at the picture of the house. She tore it in half. "That dream's gone now," she whispered. She cried softly, her tears falling onto the worn tablecloth. Days turned into weeks, and Clara couldn't find work. Factories were closing everywhere. Her savings ran out quickly. She sold her furniture, piece by piece, to buy food. First, the kitchen chairs, then the dresser, and finally, the small radio she used to listen to music in the evenings. One night, her neighbor knocked on the door with a loaf of bread. "I thought you could use this," she said gently. Clara accepted it, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." In the evenings, Clara sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker. She had once believed in a bright future, but now all she saw was darkness. Millions of stories, one tragedy. John and Clara weren't the only ones who lost everything. Their stories were repeated in every city and town across the country. Farmers lost their land. Bankers lost their jobs. Families were forced to live in makeshift homes made of cardboard and scraps. These makeshift villages were called Hoovervilles, named after President Hoover, whom many blamed for the crisis. Children who had once played in backyards now played in empty lots, using sticks and stones as toys. Some stopped going to school because their parents couldn't afford shoes or supplies. Mothers stood in soup kitchens, waiting for food to feed their families. Fathers searched for work, sometimes walking miles to factories that had long been shut down. The crash had taken more than money. It had taken hope. People who had believed in the American dream were now questioning it. "Is this really the land of opportunity?" they asked. For many, the answer felt like a painful no, a ray of hope. But even in the darkest times, people didn't give up. Neighbors helped one another. Churches opened their doors, offering food and shelter. Communities came together. People shared what little they had, even if it was just a slice of bread or a cup of soup. John found comfort in teaching his children how to repair shoes, a small skill he had learned during his time at the hardware store. Clara volunteered at a local shelter, sewing clothes for those in need. Though their dreams had been shattered, they found strength in survival. The crash had broken their hearts, but it couldn't take away their will to keep going. And in that determination lay the seed of recovery. It would take time, but they would rise again. Together. Chapter 8. The Domino Effect. Banks, Businesses, and Unemployment. When one domino falls, the rest soon follow. The stock market crash of 1929 shook the foundation of America, but the crash itself wasn't the end. It was the spark that lit a much larger fire. The flames spread quickly, burning through banks, businesses, and factories. The economy crumbled, and lives changed overnight. At first, people thought it would pass. "It's just a temporary dip," some said. But weeks went by, and the situation grew worse. The stock market had drained money from millions of investors, but the real damage was just beginning. When people lost their savings, they couldn't spend money. And without spending, the entire system began to collapse. The banks were the first to fall. Banks had lent money to investors during the market boom. When stocks crashed, investors couldn't pay back their loans. The banks had no way to recover their money. Slowly, they began to run out of cash. In small towns and big cities, people lined up outside banks, hoping to withdraw their savings before it was too late. One morning, a man named Henry arrived at his local bank, early and anxious. He had heard the rumors. "The bank is running out of money," his neighbor had whispered. Henry wasn't taking any chances. He had saved every penny he could to send his daughter to college. When Henry reached the front of the line, the bank teller looked at him with sad eyes. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly. "We don't have any cash left." Henry's heart sank. He staggered out of the building and sat on the curb, his head in his hands. His dreams had disappeared in an instant. As banks closed their doors, businesses began to suffer. Without loans or access to credit, companies couldn't operate. Factories that once produced cars, radios, and appliances slowed down. Workers were sent home. "We'll call you if things improve," their bosses told them. But no one believed the calls would come. Martha was one of those workers. She had worked in a shoe factory for 5 years. Every day, she stitched leather soles with pride, knowing that her paycheck helped support her family. But when the factory cut back production, Martha was let go. She stuffed her few belongings into a bag and walked home, tears blurring her vision. Her children were waiting for her, excited for dinner. She had nothing to give them. The next morning, Martha joined the crowd at the local employment office. The line stretched around the block. Men in worn-out jackets, women clutching their children, and young boys hoping for small jobs all waited for a chance to earn something, anything. But there were no jobs. The factories had stopped hiring. Many had already shut down completely. Across the country, bread lines became a common sight. They formed outside churches, schools, and charities. People waited for hours to get a small loaf of bread or a bowl of soup. The food was simple, but it was better than nothing. Some families went days without a full meal. Hunger wasn't just a feeling. It was a constant companion. In New York City, a boy named Jimmy stood in line with his mother, shivering in the cold. His coat was too thin, and his shoes had holes in them. As they waited, Jimmy looked up at his mother. "Do you think we'll get bread today?" he asked. His mother nodded, but her eyes were full of doubt. She had been turned away before. The demand for food was greater than the supply. Farmers weren't spared from the crisis either. Many had borrowed money to buy equipment and expand their land during the good years. But now, crop prices had dropped so low that they couldn't even cover their debts. Corn, wheat, and cotton sat unsold in barns because no one could afford to buy them. Farmers were forced to destroy their own crops, burning them or letting them rot in the fields. On one farm, an old man named Charles stared at his fields of unharvested wheat. The golden crops swayed gently in the breeze, but they might as well have been worthless. He climbed into his truck and drove into town, hoping to sell his tractor for cash. But the tractor dealer shook his head. "Sorry, Charles," he said. "No one's buying anything these days." Back in the cities, people made desperate choices. Some sold their furniture, jewelry, and even their wedding rings. Others took to the streets, living in makeshift shelters made of scrap wood and cardboard. These shanty towns were called Hoovervilles, named after President Herbert Hoover. Many blamed him for the crisis, believing he had done too little, too late. In one Hooverville, a man named Thomas built a shelter out of broken crates and old newspapers. He had once owned a successful grocery store, but now he had nothing. His wife and 2 children huddled inside the shelter, wrapped in blankets to keep warm. At night, Thomas lay awake, thinking about how life had changed so quickly. How did we end up here? He wondered. The domino effect continued. Without jobs, people couldn't pay their rent or mortgages. Families were evicted from their homes. Apartment buildings stood empty, their windows boarded up. Entire neighborhoods became ghost towns. Schools also felt the impact. Many children stopped attending because their families couldn't afford clothes or school supplies. In one classroom, a teacher noticed her students' desks slowly emptying. By the end of the month, only half of them remained. She looked out the window, wondering how long the school would stay open. Even hospitals struggled. Without funding, they couldn't buy enough medicine or pay their staff. Sick patients were turned away, left to suffer at home. Communities that had once thrived were now filled with pain and hopelessness. But amidst the despair, small acts of kindness kept hope alive. Neighbors shared what little food they had. Churches opened their doors as shelters. Strangers offered blankets and clothes to those in need. People leaned on one another, determined to survive. The domino effect was brutal, but it wasn't unstoppable. The same spirit that had built America was still there, buried beneath the suffering. Even as factories closed and bread lines stretched on, some believed that recovery was possible. But it would take time. The country was broken, and rebuilding it wouldn't be easy. The crash had shown how fragile the system was. One failure had led to another, until the entire nation was on its knees. But the people hadn't given up. Not yet. For now, they would endure. Tomorrow was uncertain, but they still had hope that better days would come. Chapter 9. Life in the Great Depression. Struggles and survival. Every penny mattered. Every meal was a blessing. The Great Depression was not just about numbers. It was about people, ordinary men, women, and children, fighting to survive. They had to find new ways to live when the world around them crumbled. Jobs were scarce, food was limited, and every decision meant the difference between hunger and hope. In cities, families who once lived comfortably were now forced to sell everything they owned. Furniture, jewelry, even family heirlooms were sold piece by piece. People placed their belongings on the sidewalks with signs reading, "For sale, make an offer." A man would sell his coat just to buy a loaf of bread. Margaret, a mother of 3, stood outside her apartment holding her wedding ring. She had treasured it for years, but now it was her only option. Her youngest child, barely 5 years old, was hungry. Tears filled her eyes as she handed the ring to the pawnbroker. "How much can I get for this?" she whispered. He gave her a few dollars, enough to buy bread and milk for the day. For many, losing their homes was the hardest blow. Families who could no longer afford rent were evicted. They carried their belongings in carts or suitcases, wandering the streets in search of shelter. Some slept in parks, wrapping themselves in blankets made of newspapers. Others built makeshift homes out of wood scraps, cardboard, and tin. These shanty towns, known as Hoovervilles, appeared across the country. People blamed President Herbert Hoover for the crisis and named the settlements after him as a form of protest. In one Hooverville on the outskirts of Chicago, a boy named Tom shared a small shack with his parents and sister. The roof leaked when it rained, and the floor was made of dirt. But it was home. Tom spent his days collecting firewood and scraps of metal to sell for pennies. Sometimes his mother sent him to the soup kitchen to wait in line for a free meal. The bread was stale and the soup was watery, but it kept them alive. Rural areas weren't spared from the hardships either. Farmers, once the backbone of the American economy, faced ruin. Crop prices had dropped so low that farmers couldn't make a profit. Wheat, corn, and cotton rotted in the fields because no one could afford to buy them. Many farmers abandoned their land and moved west, hoping for a better life in California. But the journey was long, and the promises of jobs were often false. The Dust Bowl made things worse. In parts of the Midwest, massive dust storms destroyed farms. The skies turned dark as winds carried dirt for miles. Jessie, a farmer's wife in Oklahoma, watched as dust seeped through the cracks in their home. It covered the table, the bed, and the dishes. Her children coughed at night, their lungs filled with dirt. "We can't stay here," she told her husband one morning. With heavy hearts, they packed their truck and left everything behind. In cities, children were forced to grow up quickly. Many dropped out of school to help their families. Boys polished shoes on street corners, and girls worked as maids in wealthy households. A 12-year-old named Billy sold newspapers in New York City. He shouted headlines about bank closures and unemployment, hoping someone would buy a paper. At the end of the day, he handed his earnings, just a few coins, to his mother. "It's not much," he said. She smiled and hugged him. "It's enough." Despite the struggles, there were moments of kindness and hope. Neighbors helped one another in small but meaningful ways. If someone had extra bread, they shared it. If one family had a warm coat, they passed it down to another. Communities became lifelines. In one neighborhood, a group of women took turns cooking large pots of soup to feed the children on their street. "We don't have much," one woman said, "but no child should go hungry." Churches, charities, and shelters did what they could to provide support. At a mission in St. Louis, a man named George received a bowl of hot stew after days of hunger. He sat on a bench, eating slowly, savoring each bite. Tears streamed down his face, not because of the food, but because of the kindness behind it. "I thought people had forgotten us," he whispered to the volunteer serving him. Music and storytelling also lifted spirits. In the evenings, families gathered around radios to listen to comedies, dramas, and news. The radio was often their only escape from reality. Children laughed at jokes, and parents closed their eyes, imagining a better future. Books, too, became treasures. Libraries offered free reading programs, giving people a chance to escape into other worlds, even if only for a few hours. Not everyone was able to survive on hope alone. Some lost everything and gave up. Homeless men roamed the streets, their faces hollow and their spirits broken. In the silence of the night, you could hear their footsteps echoing as they searched for a place to sleep. But many, even in the face of despair, refused to give up. They found strength in the little victories, earning a few cents, finding a warm meal, or receiving a kind word. Martha, who had lost her factory job, began sewing clothes for her neighbors. She charged only what people could afford, sometimes accepting food instead of money. One day, a woman knocked on her door with a basket of apples. "For the dress you made my daughter," the woman said. Martha smiled and thanked her. "We're all in this together," she replied. As the Depression dragged on, people learned to make do with what they had. They patched their clothes, reused old materials, and cooked simple meals from basic ingredients. Nothing was wasted. Every penny mattered. Every meal was a blessing. The government eventually stepped in with programs to help. Public works projects created jobs, and relief efforts provided food and shelter. But for many, recovery was slow. Years of hardship had left deep scars. Despite the suffering, the spirit of survival endured. People who lived through the Great Depression often said it made them stronger. They learned the value of community, resilience, and hope. Even when everything seemed lost, they kept going. And in the end, that determination to survive, day by day, meal by meal, became their greatest victory. Chapter 10. The Government Responds. But was it too late? President Hoover said things would get better, but people weren't so sure. When the Great Depression hit, many people looked to the government for help. But in the early days, help didn't come. President Herbert Hoover had a different idea of how to handle the crisis. He believed the economy was like a machine. Sometimes it slowed down, but it would fix itself over time. He thought businesses, not the government, should solve the problem. "We just need patience," Hoover said. "The market will recover." But as months passed, it became clear that things were not improving. Bread lines grew longer. Banks continued to fail. Factories stayed closed, and unemployment climbed higher each day. People couldn't wait any longer. They needed action. Hoover finally took the first steps. He called business leaders to meetings, asking them not to fire workers or lower wages. "Keep your workers employed," he urged. Some companies listened, but others didn't. They couldn't afford to keep paying wages without making a profit. One by one, factories closed and workers were laid off. The plan wasn't working. Desperate to do more, Hoover created small programs to help. He encouraged cities to build public works projects, new roads, bridges, and dams. These projects would give jobs to unemployed men and stimulate the economy. One of the largest was the Hoover Dam, a massive project on the Colorado River. It provided thousands of jobs during construction. Workers built under the scorching desert sun, earning just enough to feed their families. Tom was one of those workers. He had lost his job as a construction supervisor in Chicago. His savings were gone, and he had moved his family to a small apartment, barely making rent. When he heard about the dam project, he packed his bags and left for Nevada, leaving his wife and children behind. "I'll send money home," he promised. The work was brutal. The heat was unbearable, and accidents were common. But Tom kept going. He thought about his family every day. Each dollar he earned brought them closer to survival. But not everyone was as lucky as Tom. For many, public works projects weren't enough. Millions remained unemployed, and the economy showed no signs of recovery. As conditions worsened, people grew angry. They blamed Hoover for not doing enough. Some accused him of ignoring their suffering. Across the country, makeshift villages of homeless people popped up. They were called Hoovervilles, a mocking reference to the president. Families lived in tents or shacks made from scrap wood and metal. Children played in the dirt while their parents searched for work. One man named George lived in a Hooverville just outside of St. Louis. He had once been a shop owner, but his business had closed after the bank took his building. Now, he and his wife slept on a mattress made of straw. "We used to have a house," George said bitterly. "Now we have this." The government handed out small amounts of aid, but it wasn't nearly enough. People wanted direct relief, food, shelter, and jobs. But Hoover didn't believe in giving out money directly. He feared that it would make people dependent on the government. "We have to help them help themselves," he insisted. As protests grew louder, a group of World War I veterans decided to take action. These men, known as the Bonus Army, had been promised a cash bonus for their service, but they wouldn't receive it until the 1940s. With no jobs and no money, they demanded the bonus immediately. In 1932, they marched to Washington, D.C., and camped in front of the Capitol. There were thousands of them, tired, hungry, and desperate. They built tents and waited for Congress to listen, but instead of getting the money, they were met with force. Hoover ordered the U.S. Army to clear them out. Soldiers used tear gas and set fire to their camps. The scene was chaotic. Families ran, coughing and crying as their belongings burned. The public was horrified. The Bonus Army incident marked a turning point. Many Americans lost faith in Hoover. They believed he had abandoned them. The president tried to defend his actions, but it was too late. Election season was approaching, and his chances of winning looked slim. In the fall of 1932, a new voice of hope emerged: Franklin D. Roosevelt. As the governor of New York, Roosevelt had already launched programs to help his state recover. He promised to do the same for the entire country. His campaign slogan, "A New Deal for the American People," captured attention. Unlike Hoover, Roosevelt believed the government should play a major role in ending the crisis. People listened to his speeches with renewed hope. "We need bold action," Roosevelt said confidently. "We cannot sit and wait for things to get better. We must act, and we must act now." On Election Day, the choice was clear. Roosevelt won in a landslide. Hoover left the White House in defeat, his reputation damaged beyond repair. As he packed his belongings, he reflected on his time as president. He believed he had done what he could. "I tried to stay true to my principles," he said. But many historians later argued that Hoover's approach had been too cautious, too slow. As Roosevelt took office in 1933, the country was still in deep crisis. But something had changed. There was a sense of possibility in the air, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, things could improve. Roosevelt's first 100 days in office would be filled with new programs, new ideas, and new hope. Looking back, people often asked, could Hoover have done more? Some believed he could have saved millions from suffering if he had acted sooner. Others argued that the Depression was too big for any one man to solve. What everyone agreed on was this: Hoover's response wasn't enough, but his legacy wasn't entirely negative. The Hoover Dam still stood as a symbol of hard work and determination. The public works projects had laid the foundation for future government programs, and while Hoover's presidency ended in failure, his mistakes helped guide future leaders on what not to do during a crisis. The Great Depression had taught a hard lesson. When one part of the economy fails, it affects everyone. The response had to be fast, bold, and widespread. The question now was whether Roosevelt could deliver what Hoover could not. For the millions of Americans still standing in bread lines, there was no time to waste. Chapter 11. Rebuilding Trust. How the U.S. began to recover. The future looked dim, but people didn't give up. When Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in March 1933, the United States was in chaos. Millions of people were out of work, families were hungry, and businesses were closing every day. Banks had failed, and trust in the financial system had vanished. But Roosevelt stood before the nation with a strong voice and a simple promise. I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. His words gave people something they hadn't felt in years: hope. But hope alone wasn't enough. Roosevelt knew he had to act quickly. His first task was to fix the banks. Without a working banking system, the economy would remain frozen. Money wasn't flowing. People were keeping their savings under mattresses, afraid to deposit them in banks. On his second day as president, Roosevelt closed all banks temporarily. It was called a bank holiday. No one could deposit or withdraw money. While the banks were closed, government officials inspected them to see which ones were healthy enough to reopen. Those that were stable would reopen first. The weak ones would remain shut. During this time, Roosevelt spoke directly to the people through radio broadcasts. These speeches became known as fireside chats. He spoke calmly, as if he were sitting in their living rooms. Your money will be safer in a reopened bank than under your mattress, he said confidently. People listened. They trusted him. When the banks reopened, long lines of people appeared, but they weren't there to withdraw money. They were there to deposit it. The strategy had worked. By restoring trust in the banks, Roosevelt had taken the first step toward recovery. But he didn't stop there. He launched a series of programs to address the nation's problems. Farmers were suffering because crop prices had fallen so low that they couldn't make a profit. To help them, Roosevelt created the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA. This program paid farmers to grow fewer crops. With less supply, prices would rise, and farmers could earn a living again. Tom, a wheat farmer in Kansas, had been struggling for years. He had watched his crops rot in the fields because he couldn't sell them. When he heard about the AAA, he felt a spark of hope. With government payments, he could finally buy new equipment and keep his farm running. For the first time in a long time, he believed that things might get better. Next, Roosevelt turned to the unemployed. Millions of men and women were without jobs, and they needed work fast. One of the most successful programs was the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC. It gave jobs to young men who worked on environmental projects, planting trees, building parks, and preventing soil erosion. John, a 19-year-old from Ohio, had been living with his parents, unable to find work. When he joined the CCC, he was sent to a camp in the mountains. There, he planted trees and built hiking trails. He earned $30 a month, most of which he sent home to help his family. The work was hard, but it gave him purpose. He felt useful again. Another major program was the Public Works Administration, PWA, which created jobs by building schools, bridges, hospitals, and roads. In cities and towns across the country, construction sites buzzed with activity. The projects not only provided jobs, but also improved infrastructure. Roads became smoother, schools became safer, and communities became stronger. For families in need of immediate help, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, provided food, clothing, and money. Margaret, a single mother with 2 children, had lost her job at a textile factory. Without income, she had been forced to sell her furniture and pawn her wedding ring. When she received food and financial aid from FERA, it was like a lifeline. She cried tears of relief as she cooked a warm meal for her children. But Roosevelt knew that true recovery required long-term change. He wanted to make sure that another financial disaster like the Great Depression would never happen again. To do this, he created new rules and regulations for banks and the stock market. The Glass-Steagall Act was one of the most important changes. It separated commercial banks from investment banks. This meant that banks couldn't use people's savings to gamble on the stock market. The act also created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, which insured people's deposits. If a bank failed, the government would pay back the money. This gave people confidence that their savings were safe. Roosevelt also established the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, to regulate the stock market. Before the Great Depression, stock trading had been like the Wild West, full of risk, speculation, and dishonest practices. The SEC introduced rules to make sure that companies were honest about their finances and that investors were protected. Slowly, the country began to heal. Factories reopened, farms produced crops again, and more people found work. But recovery didn't happen overnight. The scars from the crash were deep. Many families had lost everything, and it would take years to rebuild their lives. Some people criticized Roosevelt's New Deal. They said the government was spending too much money and interfering too much in the economy. But for most Americans, the programs were a lifeline. They gave people jobs, food, and hope. One of the most emotional moments came in 1935, when Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act. This law created a safety net for the elderly, the unemployed, and the disabled. For the first time, older Americans had financial protection. They would receive monthly payments to help them live in dignity. An elderly woman named Helen listened to the announcement on the radio. She had worked as a seamstress her whole life, but now, at 67, she had no savings and no income. When she learned she would receive Social Security benefits, she cried with relief. "I won't be a burden on my children," she whispered to herself. "I can take care of myself." The New Deal wasn't perfect. Unemployment remained high for years, and not every program succeeded. But it laid the foundation for future growth. It restored faith in the government and showed that even in the darkest times, the country could come together to rebuild. By 1939, the economy had improved significantly. People were working again, factories were producing goods, and farmers were making profits. The scars of the Great Depression remained, but the worst was over. Roosevelt had kept his promise to help the American people. Looking back, the New Deal taught an important lesson. When faced with crisis, hope and action can create change. Roosevelt's leadership had saved millions from hunger and homelessness, and although the road to full recovery was long, the American people had proven their resilience. They had survived the storm and were ready to build a brighter future. Chapter 12. Lessons from Black Tuesday. Could it happen again? History warns us. If we don't learn from the past, it could return. The crash of 1929 wasn't just a bad day on Wall Street. It was the start of a global crisis that lasted for years. People lost their savings, homes, and jobs. Businesses closed, and families struggled to survive. But what caused such a disaster? And more importantly, could it happen again? The main cause of the crash was speculation. During the 1920s, stock prices rose quickly. Many investors believed the market would keep going up forever. They bought stocks without thinking about the risks. Some borrowed large sums of money, hoping to sell their shares at a profit. This created a dangerous bubble. The prices of stocks became much higher than the value of the companies behind them. Greed blinded people. They ignored the warnings of experts who said prices couldn't rise forever. Why worry? Investors thought. But when the bubble burst, everything collapsed. Once prices started to fall, panic spread like wildfire. People rushed to sell their stocks before they lost even more money, but by then, it was too late. Another problem was the lack of regulation. Banks had few rules to follow. They loaned money freely to people who couldn't afford to repay it. Banks even used customers' deposits to invest in risky stocks. When the market crashed, banks couldn't recover their money. Many of them shut down, and millions of people lost their life savings. The crash revealed how fragile the financial system was. One failure led to another, like falling dominoes. Investors lost money, so they stopped spending. Businesses couldn't sell their products and were forced to close. Workers lost their jobs, and without incomes, they couldn't buy anything. The cycle continued, creating a full-blown depression. But what lessons did we learn from Black Tuesday? How can we avoid the same mistakes today? The first lesson is simple but important. Be cautious with investments. The 1920s showed us what happens when people get too excited and ignore risks. Today, financial advisors often tell investors to be careful. They warn against investing all your money in risky stocks. Diversifying investments, spreading them across different areas, can reduce the chance of losing everything. Another lesson involves regulation and oversight. After the crash, the U.S. government created new laws to protect the financial system. The Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, was formed to regulate the stock market. Companies were required to provide accurate information about their finances, so investors could make informed decisions. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial banks from investment banks. This meant that banks couldn't gamble with people's savings. The FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, was also established. It insured people's bank deposits, ensuring they wouldn't lose their money if a bank failed. These protections helped restore trust in the banking system. But even with these changes, financial crises haven't disappeared. In 2008, the world faced another major crash. It was caused by risky lending, bad investments, and the collapse of the housing market. Banks gave out loans to people who couldn't afford them, just like in the 1920s. When the housing bubble burst, the global economy suffered. The 2008 crisis reminded us that history can repeat itself. Many people asked, did we forget the lessons of Black Tuesday? Although the crash didn't cause another Great Depression, it created widespread unemployment and hardship. One lesson we've learned is the importance of government intervention during crises. After the crash of 1929, President Hoover didn't act quickly enough. He believed the economy would recover on its own. But by the time help arrived, it was too late for many families. Roosevelt's New Deal programs helped turn things around by providing jobs, food, and support. During the 2008 crisis, the U.S. government responded faster. Banks were bailed out, loans were given to struggling companies, and programs were launched to help homeowners. These actions prevented the situation from becoming much worse. But is our current system safe? Can we really prevent another crash? The truth is, no system is perfect. While regulations have helped reduce risks, new challenges continue to arise. Today, much of the financial market is controlled by computers. Stocks are bought and sold in milliseconds by algorithms. This can cause sudden price drops known as flash crashes. Globalization also adds complexity. Markets around the world are connected. If one country experiences an economic crisis, the effects can spread quickly to others. What starts as a small problem can grow into a global disaster. So, what can we do to protect ourselves? First, we need strong regulations that adapt to new technologies and changing markets. Governments must closely monitor banks and financial institutions. They need to ensure that risky behavior is punished and that warning signs are not ignored. Second, individuals must be responsible with their investments. It's easy to be tempted by quick profits, but history has shown us that this can be dangerous. Learning about financial risks and making informed decisions is key to avoiding personal losses. Lastly, we need to remember that economic growth can't be built on speculation alone. In the 1920s, the economy seemed strong, but much of it was based on paper wealth, money that existed only because of rising stock prices. True economic strength comes from producing goods, creating jobs, and investing in long-term development. Even though Black Tuesday happened almost 100 years ago, its lessons are still relevant today. The crash taught us about the dangers of greed, the importance of regulation, and the need for quick government action during crises. But it also showed us something deeper: the resilience of the human spirit. After the crash, people didn't give up. They worked hard, helped one another, and rebuilt their lives. The recovery was slow, and the scars remained for years, but they proved that even in the darkest times, survival was possible. As we look to the future, the story of Black Tuesday stands as a warning and a reminder. Crashes can happen again if we forget the lessons of the past. But if we stay cautious, informed, and prepared, we can protect ourselves and avoid repeating the same mistakes. Could another crash as big as 1929 happen today? The answer is yes, if we let it. But with the right actions, we can keep history from repeating itself. The power is in our hands, and if history has shown us anything, it's that we're capable of learning, adapting, and finding a way forward, no matter how tough the road may be.